Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to Epic Comic Book Wednesday. This is a world's finest collaboration between myself and Michael K Vaughan, where we combine the forces of stately Vaughan Manor and Hyde Cottage to talk about the comic books on which we have wasted our separate youths. It started out as a feature on Michael's channel, where he was talking about Marvel's epic reprint collection, which is really nice, square-bound, full-color paperback reprint volumes that bounce all around in chronology. So you never know what epic collections are going to come out from week to week. And I like that idea so much that I horned my way in, and as penance, it's Michael who does the picking on anything that we're going to do from week to week, which can lead to disagreements. Because sometimes when he doesn't like something that I like, he likes something that's bad. But this week, there's no trouble along those lines. This week, it's Kull. King Kull. Kull the Conqueror, Kull the Destroyer, or as this huge hardcover omnibus would have it, Kull the Savage. And there you have on the cover really the shorthand for the character. You have the tigers, which are his spirit animal, but you also have the crown, but also the axe. Kull was a barbarian. In Robert E. Howard's original story from the beginning decades of the 20th century, before he wrote Conan, Kull was a barbarian from Atlantis. Not the exotic, sophisticated kingdom from either Plato or the Submariner, but rather a land of barbarians off the west coast of the world, the known world. One of the greatest kingdoms of which in that known world was a place called Valusia that had been around forever and was ruled from the Topaz throne. And Kull is a barbarian from Atlantis who might have germ of greatness about him, but he also has a brain and compassion. And it's the compassion that actually gets him exiled from his homeland, because he comes across a crowd of people getting ready to burn a woman to death and saves her from her horrible fate. Now, in standard heroic comics, you would think that means he saves her, but he doesn't. Instead, he hurls a dagger straight into her heart to give her the ease of a quick death, a quick and painless death, as opposed to being burned to death. And for showing that mercy, he is exiled from Atlantis. He is driven out. He would have been killed if he hadn't fled. He comes to the mainland. This is all we learn all of this in flashbacks. There are no stories from Robert E. Howard's pen of Kull in any of his earlier incarnations. So he grows up in Atlantis. He leaves when he's fairly young, but we don't know if he was too young to have adventures. He might have had adventures in Atlantis. He comes to the mainland, and in Valusia, he is all things. He is abandoned in the hills. He is a galley slave for years, rowing, chained to an oar. He is a gladiator in the arenas of Valusia, being bet on by its decadent noble people. And eventually, he rises through means that we never learn from Robert E. Howard to command the Black Legion, to be the foremost military commander under Valusia's King Borna. As we see in the comics that we're talking about today, comics have to piece together origin stories. That's what comics do. Eventually, Kull takes the crown from the king. Rips it from his gory head, as we're told in By This Axe I Rule. He rips it from the king's gory head and becomes king of Valusia. And you're supposed to see in that an enormous contrast, an attractive storytelling contrast. Here you have a hard man, a man at arms, a man who has been a slave, a man who has been a barbarian, ruling an old and gone-to-seed kingdom. Valusia is powerful, but it is old, it is decadent. Its nobles are soft. Its armed men might be tough, but none as tough as Kull, and all trained to think of Atlanteans as barbarians, just as Atlanteans think of Picts as barbarians. Kull comes to that throne, and it chafes him. He is fundamentally a man of action. It chafes him to be sitting around making laws to a savage horde, a savage people that hoard and sleep and feed and know not him. And if that premise sounds familiar to you, those of you who might be only vaguely familiar with Robert E. Howard's works, that's because it is. Robert E. Howard took that story, King Kull, chafing on his throne, yearning for action, and transmuted it years later into the Phoenix on the Sword, into the story that introduces Conan. his far, far more popular character, who is at the time king of the greatest nation state, the greatest nation in his world, Aquilonia. Conan's world is long, long after the world of Kull. Kull comes from a time before the world broke. It comes from the pre-cataclysmic era when Atlantis still stood and had not yet fallen. So the names of the countries are all different. The borders are all different. But that is basically the same premise. Kull is a king who is a man of action and is forced to rule his country. He's forced to deal with counselors and ambassadors and court intrigue, just the way King Conan is. The main difference being that, well, there are two differences. One is a fire of inspiration. Robert E. Howard chronicles this himself. That with Conan, he felt like he was creating something immortal. He felt like he was creating Sherlock Holmes, Tarzan, Dracula. He felt that, and it felt different. And creators always comment on that. Or rather, a lot of them do. Some of them aren't aware of what they're creating, but a lot of them, once they hit pay dirt, once they hit a character that they know is perfect, they feel it. And Robert E. Howard did, and he didn't feel that with Kull. So when it came to Conan, he started generating material, a lot of material. We don't have that much for Kull. All of Robert E. Howard's Kull writings fit in a relatively slim volume. And they are slim also in terms of detail. And that's the key difference. That knowledge that Robert E. Howard had that he was creating a better character, simply a better character, is one thing. And the other key difference is that with Conan, King Conan has had a background not all that different from King Kull. He too has been a galley slave, a corsair, a thief, a reaver, a slayer, a commander of men. He too has been all of those things. But the thing about Conan is that Robert E. Howard's stories start to bounce around in his chronology. They start to tell us stories from different periods of his life, different adventures. Is he young? Is he old? Is he older? Is he almost king? That sort of thing. That, for whatever reason, I would say the market, which is a very unglamorous reason, for whatever reason, Robert E. Howard never got around to doing that with Kull. Or this character might have taken off. There isn't much functional difference between him and Conan. And the sorceress elements are the same in both cases. They originate in Kull. Nothing quite like that first Kull story had ever been seen before. Robert E. Howard does have a legitimate claim, slim but true, to the title of originator of a subgenre. I think he was hugely influenced by John Carter of Mars. Hugely. But in John Carter of Mars, there are all sorts of weird things, creatures posing as gods, men who have mental powers, that sort of thing. But there isn't really any sorcery. Not really. There are things that are mistaken for sorcery, or that might be a minor grade stew of sorcery and science. But in Kull, there is sorcery. So Kull is a man who is able to face any kind of physical hardship, any kind of physical opposition. He can hack his way through a room of opposing swordsmen. But he also has to face other things, mysterious forces, sorcerous things like serpent men or werewolves. And it's a great combination. Now, Robert E. Howard worked it to much better effect later with Conan, and Conan is forever encountering not only sorcerous creatures, but holdovers from a pre-human world, dinosaurs, giant bats, giant moths, giant praying mantises. It stands to reason that Kull's world would have had a lot more of those than Conan's world did, since it was pre-cataclysm that probably killed a lot of those things. But we don't get a chance to see that. We don't. When Kull was a bandit leader for years, what kind of adventures did he have? We don't know. What was the story about how a successful gladiator in the arena, a slave, came to the king's notice and was allowed to enter the ranks and eventually rise to be the foremost military man in the kingdom? We don't know that story. We don't get it from Robert E. Howard. And there's been precious little in the way of Kull pastiche fiction. Which is not true for Conan. Every single minute of Conan's life has been chronicled from start to finish. Nevertheless, when Marvel Comics in the 70s bought the franchise to adapt Conan the Barbarian into a comic book, as we've mentioned here in Comic Book Wednesday, that was a bit of a gamble. Nobody was sure. Stan Lee, Roy Thomas, nobody was sure whether or not it would catch on, whether or not people would like it. And they did. Conan the Barbarian came out, and it was a hit. People liked it. So a year later, Marvel decided, well, if it was good once, we'll try it again. So they adapted another Robert E. Howard character, and that was King Kull. This character here. Let me show you. This was the first issue. Kull the Conqueror, #1, 15 cents. I remember this issue. You see there the tiger in the background, the spirit animal. This is an adaptation and a pastiche. It's kind of a mosaic. Because like I said, Roy Thomas knew that he had to tell an origin story, and that you had to introduce Kull. You maybe at this point in the 70s, maybe you didn't fully need to introduce Conan, and you don't need to introduce Conan at all now. But Kull, you sort of had to make people aware of who this guy was. So he gets an origin story at the beginning, and there are things about it that are good and things about it that aren't good. There's a Roy Thomas, and that means that the writing will be good, really good, especially if it's a product that Roy Thomas really likes. So that would be sword and sorcery fantasy, and also nostalgia. Anything nostalgia, anything written in history, Roy Thomas is really good at. I would argue that the art team is bad in this first issue, not necessarily because they produce bad artwork, but because they are a really bad combination. The penciler is Ross Andru, who is a very loose-jointed, kinetic artist, very much like Gil Kane. But I don't know if you can make it out there. The inker, all-important inker, is Wally Wood, who we've seen on Comic Book Wednesday before when he does his own artwork. He is a very traditional inker, a very solid, move from panel to panel inker, not kinetic at all. Very much in the sense of, for instance, Joe Sinnott, an inker like Joe Sinnott, who is really good when he has an artist that will work well in that style, but otherwise stiffens everything up, takes the life out of it. And I think you can see in this issue that the inking and the penciling are just sort of working against each other. They're in an awkward tension all throughout this first issue, which recounts the story of King Kull coming to the throne. It recounts him as a boy. It recounts him fleeing Atlantis. We get this wonderful montage of all the different periods of his life, all the different roles that he has portrayed. And then we get the climactic battle with the king, and then he puts on the crown and is king. But the artwork problems change in the next issue. They get better. They get completely better. Because the artwork team changed from Ross Andru doing the pencils and Wally Wood doing the inking to John and Marie Severin doing the artwork together. And oh my, is it a treat. It is wonderful. This is the opening panel there. Just look at that panel. Look at what's going on. Picture the panel without the word burdens. You can see everything that's going on. You don't need the words at all. But I want to show you something else too. Look at this. Here is the next page. And you have people who look like people. But look at this. Look at this top panel. Look at that detail. That is just amazing. It's absolutely amazing. Long before you had any kind of computer background work or tracery or anything like that, that is just beautiful. And you get that all throughout the John and Marie Severin issues. Let me find you another. Like, for instance, at one point, Kull is suspecting that there is a traitor in the palace. And he is told, in order to lure the traitor out, you should go to your bed and pretend to sleep. Notice these panels are crowded and full of dialogue as the plan is hatched. Is this guy a murderer or is he not? But look what they do once Kull goes to his chamber. They don't muddy it up with dialogue. Instead, we see his eye just barely open. There is the scar that he got when he took his kingdom. Let me get you another one here. Although it's not hard to pick. There are amazing things throughout here. The Severins do such an incredible job with the artwork. And I believe they are heavily influenced by Hal Foster, by Prince Valiant. I don't know that for sure. I don't think there's ever been an official history of any of this. So you're sort of piecing things together as you go. But I see way too many similarities. Look at this. This is the opening page to issue number 2. That's the scene setting up here. Guards, braziers, palaces in the background, all kinds of people. And then this is basically the splash panel. multiple tiers of nobles feasting. Even when you get way up top there, there's still plenty of detail. Plenty of detail. They aren't just blurs. And when you get down to the bottom here, look at how beautiful that is. That is just lovely. And that, I believe, owes a lot. See, here's another example. This is Kull just remembering what it was like for him to be a youth and have the tiger as his spirit totem. But look at how beautiful that is. Look at that is a beautiful panel on its own. In this particular issue, he encounters a stranger named Thalsadun, who rubs people the wrong way. People aren't exactly sure of him. They don't really know what to make of him. And I want to point out here, just in general, for when you come into your own kingdom, if somebody's last name is Doom, that's a red flag right there, as you can see in this great panel. Look at this. Look at what the Severins do in this panel. Just incredible. We see his true nature by candlelight. That actually his true nature. See, this is what you're going to get if you pal around with somebody named Doom. You're going to get panels like that. That's not somebody who wishes you well. But when we see him for real, revealed as he is, that's his true face. Just amazing. Just incredible. There's one other panel that I wanted to show you. Not all of this supernatural stuff, good as it is, but one other panel that shows you what the Severins really did. The Night of the Red Slayers is, I think, the one that has it. These are more or less, these early 70s issues of Kull in Marvel are more or less faithful adaptations. That right there is the morning after every one of my marriages to Deb. Just fantastic visual. But I want to, no, it's the next issue. It's, this is how it starts. Look at that. He's firing an arrow at you, at the viewer, in a forest, and look at all the detail in the forest. It's amazingly good. But there's a panel in this issue where he is looking at his court. His court is unpacking treasures that have been sent to him. Oh, well. I'm not going to find that panel, the one that I want. But I can show you another one that's just as good. In the next issue, Kull finds a hidden city deep beneath the earth. He's talked into it by this scholar right there, the one who's rejoicing. Who just says over and over again, the city, the city, the city. Look at the detail of that panel. Just amazing. Look at that detail. You get great adventures like this all throughout these issues of this first 1970s run on Kull. Unfortunately, until the artwork changes. The scripting stayed relatively stable, but the artwork went to Mike Ploog, who is an artist that Michael K. Vaughan likes a lot. At least Michael K. Vaughan is willing to say that Ploog is miscast as an artist for Kull. That is absolutely true, and that's when I sort of lost interest. But Marvel did Kull again later on. A decade later, they did this, Kull the Conqueror. That's issue number 1, which had a wraparound cover. A beautiful thing for a comic that what was this, $1.25? Yeah, it was $1.25. You get a wraparound cover for this thing. And you get absolutely fantastic John Josema artwork. Just look at that. Look at how amazing that was. Here, let me get it back here. That's just incredible. And this particular issue is really long. It's like 60 pages of comic book, and it's about a tribe of women who are, unbeknownst to our characters at first, were tigresses, which brings them into direct conflict with Kull, whose totem beast is the tiger. And the artwork all throughout these first few Buscema issues, this 80s Marvel Kull adaptation went on, much like the 70s one, it went on past its prime. But for the first few issues, apparently from Michael K. Vaughan's video, there is an anthology that collects those issues. I have the individual ones in my long boxes, but I don't have that collection, and I wouldn't get it because I know what comes after. Those collections, even on the secondhand market, are not cheap. I would be paying a relatively large amount of money for a thing that I only like the third of its content. So I'm content with the digital versions. Like for instance, in this issue where they go to that underground city, they encounter the creature that lives in it, swirling up out of the water, and of course the men might fear, but Kull is a barbarian born, and he attacks it directly. But look at that top panel. If that isn't influenced by Hal Foster, by Prince Valiant, then I'm the Tsar of all the Russias. That is certainly the case. Not that I'm complaining, because look at how beautiful that is. Just incredible. And the comic books, the initial run on this 70s Kull was a treat to revisit. But it did remind me of a whole bunch of things that frustrate me about Kull. The main one of which I can lay either at Robert E. Howard's door or at Marvel's door. And that is that this character misses out. There's a huge amount of missed opportunities here. We don't know anything about Kull's world. We don't know anything about his past. We don't know anything about the adventures that he's had facing sorceress foes or otherwise. We don't know anything about the kingdom of Valusia, even once he becomes its king. We don't know what he does as king. Those are weaknesses. Those are huge unexploited things that writers, I don't know actually who owns the rights to Kull right now. I have no idea whether or not they're free by Robert E. Howard's literary estate to tell new Kull stories. I don't know. Maybe Michael K. Vaughan would know the answer to that. I don't know why we don't get them, though. I don't know why we don't get, here's a story from when Kull was a pirate or a gladiator. Here's a 6-issue story arc from when Kull was a gladiator. I don't know why we don't get that. There's virtually no way that you could interrupt Kull continuity by fleshing out background stories like that, because there's hardly any Kull continuity to begin with. He has a couple of great villains, the Serpent Men, Thulsa Doom. He has a great supporting cast, which is something that you can't say for Conan. Because we meet Kull when he is a king, in other words, when he is stationary, when he's the same person day to day, doing the same things day to day, we get to have a supporting cast. There's Bruhl, the spear slayer, who is the son of the Pictish ambassador. So in other words, Kull has a long-standing personal prejudice against his people, but they become friends anyway. In fact, Michael K. Vaughan says in his video on this, I'll leave a link to his video down below, he says that Kull is simply not interested in women. He's not interested in romance. And I am not the first person, nor would I be the first person to write pastiche fiction, in which the reason for that is because he's very much interested in Bruhl, the spear slayer, who they become best friends. It's an easy jump to make that they also become lovers. But there's Bruhl, who's always by Kull's side, and even though Bruhl is from a barbarian people, just like Kull, he's constantly telling Kull to back away from danger. You're a king. You're not just a warrior anymore. The whole kingdom rides on you. And they are often backed into corners together, spear and axe or sword, fighting against, again, superhuman or human enemies. There's also an aged counselor. He's not a warrior at all. We barely learn anything about him, Counselor 2. We barely know anything about him. And we could stand to learn a lot more. What's it like for Kull to govern? Is he able to transfer any of the instincts that were honed as a slave, as a barbarian, as an exile, as a gladiator? Is he able to transfer any of those instincts to ruling? Now, I confess, Robert E. Howard didn't do much along those lines with Conan either, but Conan pastiches have. There was a successful title called King Conan 50 years ago from Marvel, and there is currently an ongoing comic called King Conan, in which we meet his son, Khan, and all of his advisors, and we see what it's like for him to be king. I love the Kull stories, absolutely love them. I love the old Bantam paperback that I just recently found again at the Brattle. I love the new trade paperback called Kull, Exiled from Atlantis, that arranges the stories really well and has lots of original artwork all throughout the book. I love those things. But I could stand to read a lot more Kull comics than I've ever seen. I bought the whole run of the Marvel Kull in the 70s, and I stuck around for Marvel Kull in the 80s a lot longer than I wanted to, a lot longer than they were paying me back, because I like this character, and it would be neat if somebody could flesh out the potentials. But that is, I don't have any of these anthologies, these hardcover things. I have the digital comics for the original Marvel run with John and Marie Severin, and boy, oh boy, has that been a treat to revisit. I had forgotten how technically wonderful their artwork is. Totally different from the kind of comic book artwork that I usually love. I usually am much more a fan of Gil Kane or even Ross Andru or John Buscema at their operatic height, with huge action going all kinds of places and big dramatic panel layouts. The Severins are much more like Wally Wood. They're much more like Hal Foster, where each panel is a little filigreed work of art. And there are big, you saw, there are big dramatic moments, but they are meant to be very different from the rest of what's going on. Ordinarily, I lose a little patience with that, but when it came to the Severins, I was on board completely. And I'm glad that Marvel has done them proud. Michael K. Vaughan in his video holds up some really nice-looking anthologies, things that, as he correctly points out in his video, you should try to find if you're interested, because they won't be around for long, and they will be intensely collectible. I don't think anyone will ever reprint these issues again. I think Marvel's done by now a long 6-foot shelf of hardcover omnibus reprints of their original years adapting Conan. And they've done the few volumes they need for Kull, and I don't think anyone's ever going to do that again. So if you're interested, those prices, especially for those Kull volumes, is only going to go up. So you should take advantage of them now. But we are not meaning on Comic Book Wednesday to impoverish you, just to intrigue you. So this was a hit. Michael K. Vaughan picked something that I love. Whether or not that stays true next week, we shall see. We'll encounter it together. Until then, I will see you later. Thank you, BookTube.